Well, hi everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Certified Forgotten. You boys are feeling low energy, so we're going to come out of the gate especially strong in order to make up for that. Isn't it right, Donato?
It is. I appreciate the honesty there, because I mean, the last podcast we talked about, I was coming off the CCA high and a bunch of other really exhausting things, and I think we're trading places. So, this is just life. This is how life goes, and we're allowed to be low energy some days, and other days we're riding high.
And our wonderful guest this week asked us not to put on airs. So we're coming out, we're speaking the truth, man. And if you're afraid to hear us speak our truths, to tell you how things really are in the film world, man, then I don't fucking know what to tell you because you just ain't ready to hear it.
I mean, it is a shame that the people listening don't have the picture of you in a hoodie with the hood pulled over your head saying this,
I'm
because
chilly.
it is a certain kind of picture there, a little conspiracy kind of high on life picture I'm getting.
I aspire to be the Breitbart of film criticism. Oh wait, that was called Rebeller and it died. Anyways, welcome to Certified Forgotten. I am one half your Matt host, Matt Monagle as always. I'm joined by my good friend Matt Donato, and we are joined by our good friend. Oh wait, I don't do the introductions. Donato, I'll let you do this.
You're so out of whack. You just taken my job. You're just trying to step all over my feet, but I will make it short and sweet. We have had this guest on to talk about the Poughkeepsie tapes, an episode that we got into some pretty heavy topics on. And you know what? I was almost going to say I don't think we're going to get that heavy again, but we're talking about another true crime kind of horror thriller, and I don't know. Who knows? We're going to see where this goes. So, yeah, we are bringing back horror journalist Ari Drew. Ari, welcome back.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for having me back after we talked about murder and all these really horrific things in the last episode.
You are by far, I think, the most chill guest who brings us the darkest shit, which is sort of like a nice little. It's a nice little niche to own, I think, as a podcast guest.
I love it. I'll take that. Yeah, I really find that whenever I'm allowed to pick movies to discuss on podcasts, I pick some heavy shit. And the funny thing is that I picked this one because I thought it would be fun. And then I rewatched it and I was like, oh yeah, this is pretty dark at times, and the end's really dark. Anyway, yeah, whatever. It's my curse, but I'll own it.
And like
Yeah.
we'll get into it in a little bit, obviously, when we talk about the film itself. But I did laugh at the fact that our group text, our group DM that we had when we're trying to plan this, you sent a message and you're like, "Oh, I remember." Like, I didn't remember this being as trashy as it was, so I was expecting something funnier, something more akin to a like trash midnighter. And I'm sitting there watching this, going like, "I don't know, when does it get trashy?" Because this is heavy shit.
I'll have to explain what I meant by that, but it like really captures a certain and I may be I was trashy in the line of kind of like sleazy and cheap at times as far as like violence and just kind
Mm.
of how it comes at you real hard. So yeah, we can get it, definitely dive into that in a bit.
Oh, we'll get into that. That's going to be fun.
Hmm.
So, you have been on the podcast before, Ari, and you have talked
Mhm,
about sort of your history as both a horror lover and a horror journalist. So, I would
mhm.
recommend our listeners go listen to the Poughkeepsie tape episode. Wasn't even close to getting that out. Didn't even back up and try and do it. Go to that episode, listen to what Ari has to say. But when I logged on, you were in the middle of kind of an interesting conversation about moving, and so I want to do as two-thirds of our podcast have at some point in the last few years moved and had to sort of rebuild their community and their horror community in new cities.
Mhm.
That's the thing that I would like to talk about to kick us off here a little bit today is as film lovers, especially coming out of like this pandemic environment, if you're thinking that you want to go to a new place, how do you build a film community in a brand new city? And Ari, I think you probably are our leading expert on that, having just gone through that process.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's not quite the same for me because with the move, the cities that we were considering moving to, I kind of made sure that we already had like a nice social source of social support there, particularly
Mhm.
with regard to film, because of course my husband works in film and writes and needs to be in places where it's easy to see, good screeners and have a good community there. Um, so, but I will say that I was fortunate enough to already know a couple of wonderful film loving folks, filmmakers here in Denver. And one of the first things I saw, they do run, this is Brad McCarg and Becky Sayers. They run trivia at a horror bar called Slashers. And so I actually have been pretty proactive about, going to that and meeting other fans and people that they know here, and then going to other trivias and meeting new people and kind of exploring. I don't really, like, I'm not really shy about meeting new folks at bars and making quick friends. So yeah, kind of looking for the horror trivia scene, and then I got an idea of what was going on as far as just different community events, screenings, and fun horror meetups and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I guess you just got to search out the right places and the right people. And I don't know. I'm a queer man, so I end up at queer places, and a lot of queer people love horror, so that helps as well for me to have gotten plugged in here. But it was definitely an adjustment after having been in the same place for a long time. But luckily, the pandemic showed us that we can connect with people all over the country. And, two of you being those kinds of folks for me. And even though Matt, you and I lived in Austin at the same time, but
we were really bad about making hangouts
oh
happen.
God,
Like there
horrible.
were texts, like I think there was a couple of times when Trace and I were like, we're definitely coming to movie night or whatever, and it just never happened. So
yeah,
mea culpa to the extreme on that for me.
Yeah, you're fine. I mean, again, it's I had no shortage of, film loving friends, and it's kind of something that I tend to seek out. I don't know. I love talking about films, and I love horror, and I love, talking to other people who write about horror, because it's my bread and butter, it's my comfort, it's what keeps me sane, honestly. So, yeah, just a lot of very proactive work on my part, and I'm an outgoing person for the most part. So, I've lucked out here. It's been nice. I found a really nice community here.
I think it's always funny, like when I moved to LA, I definitely picked LA in mind of the same thing you said, Ari, of, well, I know people here, I'm moving to a
Mhm.
place where I have a community set already, and these are people that I've met at festivals and good friends who have moved to LA and all these things. But I think the funniest part after living here, 3+ years, maybe lockdown doesn't count, obviously, but still having lived here long enough to have a social life and do things, you know, I see these people at film festivals, and we're great friends, and we see each other for like a week at a time, 10 days at a time. And then I'm like, oh my God, like I'm actually moving to your city. Like we're going to see each other all the time. But hilariously enough, like the people I see the most here now, half of them are just like brand new friends I've made through other people. And like some of the people I see the least, I saw way more when I didn't live here and would just go to film festivals. Like it's just such a funny little dynamic that happens when all of a sudden,
Mhm.
like you go to a place and you're there and it's easy to see somebody. So like you never end up doing it. We just did like a hangout recently with like Dorina and Haley and Angel from Fango and all these people. And like, we're just sitting there
Mhm.
going like, why don't we do this more often? And like, that was the actual question. And we all sat each other like, we're actually going to do this more often because we're dumb and we just don't do like the proactivity of it all. So yeah, I think building that community is actually doing it. That's the hard part. It's
Yeah,
easy to put yourself in the place. It's hard to actually, Ari, you're doing trivia all the time. Like you have Brad and Becky, and you go out and do things with them. I see your social media posts and stuff like that. So it's like you just got to put the work in, and like it all kind of falls into place.
exactly. It's like any relationship. It takes multiple sides, putting in effort and making it work and reaching out. And luckily, like, I have friends here that love films that I really like being around. So I see them, pretty much weekly, and we watch a lot of movies and talk about movies, and it's really lovely actually. I did have that in Austin, the 10 plus years I lived there, but it's kind of like a more intimate thing here, just because I don't know as many people here. So I value those little times I have with the people I do know well, as much as I can.
Okay, wait. This is my question for you. Well,
Uh-huh.
it's a two-part question. Number one, what is the food you miss the most from Austin? Number two, what is the food you've been surprised by the most in Denver?
Interesting.
Oh, that's a good question. Those are good questions. Food I miss the most in Austin. Oh gosh. Okay, this is silly because it's a chain, but they don't have it here. So it's Papacitos restaurant. It's a Mexican chain, like in the Papas family. So there's like Papado, the seafood one, and then a steakhouse. Papacitos had, like, I literally, for whatever reason, every birthday I would have a dinner there in Austin. And I don't know. It's just like very comforting. It's so fucking good. I don't know. So I miss that. So I actually have been trying to hunt down like good kind of, something between Tex-Mex and authentic Mexican food. I found some places here, but nothing quite matches that. So yeah, that's definitely one of them. Here, oh gosh, I don't know what I've been surprised by. You know what? Actually, so I when I lived in New York for college for undergrad, I spent a lot of time eating at like Ray's Pizza and like pizza, which is the one near my dorm freshman year is genuinely fantastic. It's kind of like a New York chain, but yeah. So I've been missing kind of like streetza, like really good New
Mm-hmm.
York style pizza. And there are a couple places here that have really fantastic slices. So I'll get like for my first few weeks here, I was getting like 2 slices for lunch every day. Like I lived in the city, and it was it was interesting because I'm like, oh yeah, that Denver, that authentic Denver pizza. But they're really fucking good. So shout out to Garlic Knot, and the other one's called like Pizza 76 or something. So yeah. Anyway, pizza surprise with the pizza for sure.
I like this line of questioning, and selfishly, I like it because my wife and I are starting to have those first thoughts, inklings, planning sessions about what happens when we leave Austin, because
Mm,
Texas was never going to be our forever home, and we're kind of getting into a window now. We have two nephews that live up in New York City, out on Long Island. We're started to think, okay, where in the Northeast could we settle down and stay for effectively the rest of my working life? But it's these sort of things that like it's kind of a proposition before where like you move because of opportunity for most of your career, especially when you're younger, and then
hmm.
moving because of a place that you are like you get to a point in your career where like the opportunity will follow no matter what. So I want to like pick a place that I can feel that I can like have a sense of community in, that I have access to the things I want to have access in. It's a weird little inventorying thing where you're like, okay,
Yeah.
what food do I want? Like what art is important? Definitely need
Yeah.
a bookstore, but do I need like a local stage theater so I can do like musical theater or something? Is that a priority? Is it not? And it's an interesting process too of being like, all right, if you choose a place where you don't know anybody, or think about a place that you don't know anybody, how do you do that as a somebody that will be probably in their 40s when I decide to make that move? How do you sort of like start over socially in a way that feels good and
Hmm.
but doesn't isn't overwhelming or isn't kind of oppressive and making you feel like you've lost all the things that you used to love about where before? So it's like big philosophical life changing questions, and it really helps me to think of it in terms of like got a pizza place, like as silly as that is, that's really like
Yeah.
that's an achievable outcome where you're like found a pizza place that I really like. I'm good. I have one thing there that I know that I love.
Hmm. Yeah, seriously, whenever we were when I was doing my interview process that landed me here for my other career, for my for my
Mm-hmm.
PhD stuff, we had a spreadsheet that literally ranking different factors from 1 to 5 based on cities, based on, availability of, honestly, one of the things was that Trace was really big on was like, is there an Alamo Draft House there? There was a huge thing. And actually, the more I thought about it, the more I was like, holy shit, yeah, I'm gonna kind of need that, like, for my well-being.
Yeah.
Like I need my place where people are, not allowed to talk at the movies, which, having been to a few non-draft house theaters recently, it's not my favorite experience. So those things were all part of the consideration, and literally it came down to like numbers. Like we each got to to rank different cities, and luckily Denver kind of hit a really nice sweet spot with like access to all the things that we really like, still having close access to like festivals, and especially the new thing is like near the mountains. I really love the mountains and like small cute little towns and stuff, and doing mini trips for the weekend just in a nearby
Mm-hmm.
town. And so we've been exposed to that kind of energy here, which I really love. And then there's a lot of spooky shit, which I especially love. We're really close to like Stanley Hotel and things like that.
It was funny for me because when I moved at the age of 30 out of the East Coast, essentially, like I hadn't really gone farther than Texas. I did visit LA, and that's why I knew it was in the running, let's say. But I mean, my two places I picked were either LA or Austin. Like those were my two because I knew I had communities there. I knew I had people in both cities that I would fall in with very quickly. But I mean, my biggest thing was kind of weather. Like I was done
Mm,
with the
hmm.
cold,
Yeah.
so I picked two extremes to say like, no, I'm done with seasons. We're gonna do things in a way. Of course, before I knew, Texas got some pretty bad snowstorms. Obviously, that we all
Hmm.
saw how things happened. But I
Yeah.
mean, like
Yeah.
the breaking factor for me was the humidity, like getting down to the nitty gritty. And I'm just like, I've been in Austin where I've been sweating just from walking outside. It's so humid.
Oh yeah.
Versus LA and like the dry heat. And like that was just such a huge thing to me. Pizza was another one. I was like, I'm gonna lose pizza no matter what. But what am I trading it for? And I kind of was like, I can trade it for tremendous tacos and burritos. I do miss barbecue. Don't get me wrong. Barbecue is a hard fight to say. Like, if I could have had Austin barbecue all the time, I was probably, it wasn't going to end well. So I was like, I might as well just keep visiting Austin and getting my fill, whether that's South by or Fantastic Fest, which, I'm going to kickstart again, thank God. But yeah, I mean, like, it's so funny, those things you think about, and they seem so non-important when you are picking, let's say, but all of a sudden when you get to the nitty gritty, when you start thinking about rating things, when you think about what makes you happy, you're like, oh no, these actually matter a whole lot. And it could be the tiniest little variation of humidity that's like, nah, that's LA. Like that was the game changer.
Yeah. I just went back to the ACL Music Festival the first weekend, beginning of October, and I got out of the airport immediately drenched within like 30 seconds. It was horrible. And it made me think, like, how did I do this for 12 years? Like, this was just really, it was really jarring to go from here to there. So yeah, I'm all about getting back into the dry heat when we have heat. And actually the winters here hasn't been so bad so far. And I'm not a snow person. I hate snow. I hated it more in New York City though. So this is more manageable for me.
Yeah. Weirdly, the thing that I miss the most about New York and that I'm potentially looking forward to getting back if we move back to the Northeast is bodegas. Like, bodegas just are not a thing in Austin, Texas.
Nope.
And so, like, if I want to get a bagel, I got to go to a goddamn bagel place. Like, I'm living in the middle of the Midwest nowhere. Like, you should just be able to go to the guy at the counter and be like, bacon, egg, and cheese, please. And they'll be like, bagel. Yes, we have that. And it's really taught me that I would probably give up Tex-Mex for like access to good bagels on a regular basis, which is a wild statement. But yeah, I miss that bagel life. I miss living that bagel life so much.
I can understand it.
The street slices, you mentioned that before, Ari. That's my big thing. Now, anytime I go back to the East Coast and I get to visit Brooklyn and I get to visit New York, I have this favorite slice that is an elote pizza. And it is so goddamn good. And I got that like twice when I was at Brooklyn Horror Festival. And then I was getting like, my penne vodka slice, my chicken parm slice, like just walking into like Rosa's Pizza or like Mama 2 or something like that, and walking out and just on the way to the next bar, you're just eating your dinner on that like on like the flimsy like oil covered paper
plate. Paper plate. It's like it's transparent at that point.
And like the misunderstanding that LA kind of doesn't really have much of that. Like that culture isn't there because LA is such a big spread out city in a way, and even downtown doesn't really have a lot of those options. That was a little interesting to me. Not that it surprised me. I did go into LA knowing what I was getting into, but yeah, like not having the bodega culture and not having the street slice culture, even though you'd compare LA to New York so easily, that was a I'm still trying to deal with that some nights when it's 1 a.m. and I'm like, I want that bodega sandwich so bad, but the only thing open is like delivery Burger King. Like there aren't even diner options.
Late night diner orders and like all of that stuff. Like my favorite slice when I go back is a lasagna slice. I always love me some of that lasagna slice. So that's what I try to get whenever I go back to visit.
Well, I could wax poetic about food and location all day.
Always.
I do want to give you a chance, Ari, to kind of like weigh in a little bit on the horse scene too, because this is a conversation we've repeated a bit with our guests. It's like what you're excited about on the horizon, what you're seeing from the industry right now. And this is kind of a good time to have that conversation because it's January. We've just seen a couple of high profile releases. We have a nice blend even now of like studio films like Megan, streamer films that people are excited about like Sick. There's just a lot of good stuff happening, and then a few films coming out this weekend that we just won't talk about. But there's a lot of really good things happening in horror right now. So let me ask you this as sort of the other thing I'd love to hear your opinion on, which is what are you looking forward to in 2023 from a horror perspective? What's got you excited?
So I will say, like, having I'm a diehard slasher fan through and through. So the new Scream film coming out, obviously is something that I'm obsessed with already. I've seen the trailer 5 million times because that's what I do. And then and then I'll go see it in theaters probably like 6 or 7 times. And yeah, so definitely that's kind of a given. I think if you've ever followed me on social media, that's kind of my fanboy moment always. But I actually just wrote a piece for Bloody Disgusting on liminal horror, which included interviews with the directors of Skinamarink, The Outwaters, a film that came out earlier this month called Landlocked, and Zach Donahue, who he did The Den a while back, which is amazing, one of my favorite found footage films. And but he just released a limited horror series, kind of like it's a liminal horror, Lovecraftian, really unique web series called The Unknowable. So that was something I just kind of decided to do on a whim. I just started contacting these folks because I was seeing threads between the films and the projects, and just kind of like how it was really capturing the same vibes of kind of like I would say like something familiar that becomes particularly a little bit alien for some reason or another, because people disappear, because it's not how you remembered it being. And I think that there's something really interesting in like this post nostalgia, I won't say post nostalgia, but this idea of like, we've had a run of so many nostalgia fueled, requels and reboots and just films, and, the Stranger Things in film form, a lot of that jumping back into the 80s and 90s. And so I think this is a really interesting way for filmmakers to kind of look at that, I guess, like look at the past and their own memories and things like childhood, things that we've kind of idealized in the past in a more realistic way with some distance. And so these projects all kind of had that. If you're familiar with like liminal spaces, like there's a subset of folks on the internet who are obsessed with that imagery. But I actually like learned about liminality through this high strangeness show that I love called Hellier. And so it's just kind of this idea of being in between two spaces of transition, essentially. So I centered a whole article around that because I thought that that was a really fascinating approach, and it's a lot of DIY stuff, films made really on the cheap, but they're so effective because they tap into kind of real, I guess, like the realities of realizations of like, holy shit, that thing I remembered so fondly, for really to look at it and pick it apart, there was maybe some darkness there or something there that wasn't quite as cheery as I remembered. And so, yeah, those films, all the ones that I've mentioned, Outwaters is officially coming out next month, and I love that. That's one of my favorite films. I've seen it quite a few times, but that's a big one. I'm always intrigued to see an M. Night Shyamalan movie, whether I end up liking it or not. So I'm really excited to check out Knock at the Cabin. Um, Sick was amazing, by the way. Loved Sick. I had so much fun with it. Um, yeah, and I'm excited for Infinity Pool, which I believe comes out next week. But yeah. So yeah, I don't know. Just Matt, Monagle, that I really love me like a dark slow burn, and we have that in common with some of our favorite films. So anything like that, I'll eat it up this year. So as long as I can keep getting stuff like that, I'm all about it. But I am appreciating that films are having fun again. It feels like it's okay to like be silly and kind of stupid sometimes. Like Megan was fun. It wasn't, it's not my favorite movie of the year, but I had a lot of fun watching it, and it was a fun theater experience. And after the the months and months and months of lockdown, that can't be, the value and the experience of seeing a horror movie with people that's fun. It's can't be overstated. I really love doing that again.
Yeah, I mean, like that the idea of fun is prevalent today. If we're gonna, not to date this podcast episode and the day we're recording it, but we do know that Zach Ryger just got an 8-figure deal on his next movie because of
Yeah.
Barbarian. And what you're saying about fun and what you're saying about, I love that the year is starting with a groundswell of support for movies like The Outwaters, Skinamarink, these low budget films that live in this area that you've already described, Ari, and are succeeding on that level. But I'm also very excited for the future, that I think studios are realizing we do want that fun. We do want the Barbarian type movies as well to be in theaters. They have to get people in seats, but not to say A24 branded horror has shaped the horror landscape for a little bit, but it has. And Barbarian felt really goddamn fresh. And I'm hoping that this massive deal, and like, God bless, eight figures on a movie
Yeah.
that he wrote a script for, and they had 24 hours. Like literally they sent the script out and within 24 hours it had that deal. That's crazy.
Damn.
Is it, a commentary on maybe overspending? I don't know. We're doing a sight unseen 8-figure deal. But anyway, all the blessings to Mr. Kreger. Like that is amazing. But yeah, I'm excited for a return to, if we can get back to like the Dark Castle entertainment era
Oh yeah.
of the early 2000s, and mainstream horror is bringing that back, I would be so excited. And it's like, I hope we have both. Obviously, I hope we have what you already described, Ari, with the liminal stuff, and theaters getting back into the fact that we don't have to churn out the same studio approved BS over and over again. But I think the last thing in this all, and why these films are succeeding, because on both sides, whether it was Barbarian, whether it was Skinamarink, it was an extremely individual and personal story. Like that is a
Mhm.
creator allowed to explore their originality and to their greatest expanse and say, I'm going to do what I want to do because that's going to give the best product. And I think that's the biggest thing that, again, I hope continues. It's this idea that filmmakers should lean on their voice and they should lean on their originality. And I know that's always been there, but it always hasn't been allowed, let's say, and it's always not what has come to the
Mhm.
forefront. So if the future is what we're looking at based on what we've seen so far in the last few months, I am very hoping that studios and producers are learning that it's better to let a filmmaker to do, take that big swing, and whether it
Yep.
succeeds or doesn't, I'd rather see the 50% Rotten Tomatoes movie that has 10-star reviews and 0-star reviews than the 90% one that has a bunch of threes.
Yeah, yeah, I know, and to that point too, like Barbarian and movies like Nope, like I think they work well because they're different enough. Like they don't just give you, oh, this is like an alien story, and this is a, like a monster in the cellar story type of thing. They're fucking weird, and something about it tapping into the mainstream's tapped into it. Even like they want something different. They don't want predictable in the same way, and I like that these films like have really interesting themes and imagery and structure, and people are into it. And I think that that's what makes me really excited for the future, and letting a lot of these creators and first time directors who have these really unique visions, letting them do their thing. Like, let's just let people do their thing. Let's stop having the Weinsteins of the world dictate what happens in the next horror hit. So that's my my opinion on that as well, Matt.
And I feel like I kind of want to naturally segue there to talk about this film, because I think that if nothing else, Horsemen is such an interesting artifact of how a film can both chase a contemporary trend and do some things that are just utterly like Barbarian. The idea
Hmm.
of unique visions and largesse and excess from a film. So I say, let's take a minute away so you can hear some wonderful thing from our patrons, and let's jump into some conversation about Horsemen. So we'll be back in just a second. Hey everyone, Matt Monagle here, taking a break from today's episode to say thank you so much to those of you out there who have supported us, who have supported the website, certifiedforgotten.com, in any number of ways. By supporting our Patreon, by donating a couple of dollars every month to make sure that we can continue to pay our writers, by leaving us a review. We've got a lovely review earlier this month from a new friend in Queens. So thank you to those of you who take the time to leave reviews for us on platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and all the myriad other ones that I don't need to mention today. We talk about this a lot, but if somehow this is the first episode that you're listening to, Certified Forgotten is a labor of love between myself and Matt Donato. It is the little engine that could, and we are just in a lucky position to be able to pour our time, talent, and treasure into the website and into the podcast to keep it afloat when big business and private equity firms are killing other publications out there. So your continued support means the world to us. And as always, if you want to learn a little bit more about the website, if you want to learn a little bit more about how we're covering films outside of the podcast, please visit www.certifiedforgotten.com. That number, once again, www.certifiedforgotten.com. Back to the show. All right. Hey, welcome back. And this week on the podcast, we are talking about Horsemen, which is a 2009 procedural horror film, I guess is what you would call it, that's directed by Jonas Åkerlund, who has a lot of different titles. And I think Donato's going to talk about a few of the films that he's worked on since then in detail, because I know that you're a big fan of one of them in particular. So I'll let you dig into that a bit. But this tells the story of a Detroit cop who, after losing his wife, buries himself in his work and ends up chasing a underground quadrology of serial killers, a group of interconnected people who define their methods and methodologies after the four horsemen of the apocalypse. As each member of the serial killer group co-op comes to light, Dennis Quaid's character finds himself inching closer and closer to an outcome he does not want. It's got a really good cast. It's got maybe my favorite cast of a horror film that I've seen in a long time. It's got Zhang Ziyi. It's got Lou Taylor Pucci, who is the lead from Spring, if everybody here needs to remember why we love him so much. That is Clifton Collins Jr., because every movie of this type for a certain, about a 15-year period did have Clifton Collins Jr. Patrick Fugit, Peter Stormare. It's a good group of actors, and they are playing the types of characters that they play best. But as we always do, I'm going to start by turning metaphorically to our guest Ari and saying, why'd you pick this movie?
That is such a good question. I think the answer is probably dumber and simpler than you might hear. But I want to say, did you not? I feel like you all covered a film with a similar title recently. Did you not? It was like,
so for our Patreon content series, which is Film School from Hell, where Donato has me write about things that I haven't seen before because I'm a squish. We wrote about The Horsemen, which is a 2010
yes.
Australian thriller, which is actually extremely good. And I do remember that you, even back then on Twitter, were like, "Oh, this made me think of Horsemen." So you kind of took that ball and ran with it, and I love you for it.
I sure did, yeah, and I think I love true crime and procedurals and neo noir and a lot of films in this vein, and this kind of just hits a sweet spot for me. I saw it a bit after it was released, so I didn't even see it, in the wake of the torture porn stuff that we see influence a lot of this, and the Hostels and Saws and all of that. So I just kind of saw it. I want to say like Trace showed it to me when we were dating early on, but I remember being really pleasantly surprised because it is very twisty, and it's kind of, and when I say trashy for me, it's kind of just like it really has that late 2000s crime thriller vibe, a little bit like Untraceable, some of the other serial killer procedurals of the time. But it just it feels so exploitative in so many ways, especially by today's, I think honestly, some of the stuff in this film today, people would probably be like really pissed off or really up in arms about, or think that it was like emotionally manipulative, and it is, like, it's very of the time. But I just thought I think it's a fascinating movie. Like, some of the performances against the writing, against the tone, it's just so jarring and disorienting. So it's a really unique experience. It's not the best film I've seen, obviously, but it's it kind of hits some sweet spots, and honestly I had a lot of fun with it. And again, because I like kind of like some nasty shit, so when you can kind of be really cruel at times, and have these really kind of bombastic kills that have a lot of like really intense emotion, and oh yeah, so yeah, there's a lot that this movie does that's fun for me. And I thought, when I noticed that it didn't even have but a few reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, I was actually really shocked, just considering the cast and at the time. But hey, whatever, I got to throw it at y'all, and so thank you for biting and giving it a ride.
Is that my turn, Mr. Monagle?
Yeah, Donato, I want to ask you. I'll play this off so we can keep it in the edit. I wanted to ask you: was this your first time watching Horsemen?
It very much was, and I'm glad you asked that question, because I did want to say how often I saw the poster for Horsemen on Netflix, like in the early days of streaming, or anywhere. I don't know why, but this poster is so prevalent in my mind. And to find it had 5 total reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, I was gobsmacked, because Monagle, you mentioned the cast. I mean, we're starting with Dennis Quaid, Lou Taylor Pucci, who had not been in like Evil Dead and stuff yet, Patrick Fugit, like all these talents. Your Clifton Collins Jr. playing a character actor role that he, like, again, he was made to do. Even Eric Balfour and like Peter Stormare, just two character actors doing their thing. It just, to find it had so goddamn few critic ratings baffled me. And I tweeted out, I was just like, how does this have as many critic reviews as it has? And Mr. Richard, who is on the podcast at one point with us, informed me that it was basically buried by Lionsgate on theatrical. I think like The Haunting of Connecticut came out in 2 weeks or something, so they put all their eggs in that basket. But it did have a DVD push, so I guess that might explain it, in the sense where critics aren't going to touch it once it goes to DVD. You have to do theatrical or nothing. But I was just like so thrown by that. And the film itself, it made me think of all the torture porn stuff, Ari, 100%. Like, you're trying to capitalize on the Saws and the Hostels and whatever came out in that time with some pretty graphic imagery. But you're also doing, you know, with John Barkan, who was on the podcast, and we did, you know, the Crimson whatever film that we covered, and it was a religious true crime serial killer kind of flick that went full bore into the religious aspect, and all of a sudden you have like monks and priests, and it goes full force into it, where I feel like Horsemen dangles the religious nature of it as a influence, and kind of doesn't go as deep into it as I would have liked. It's not like a 7 or anything like that, where it's really getting into the mythology. But no, I was just I was thrown by how capable it was for how underseen it actually is.
Yeah, and it seems to hit, we kind of talked about this before the break, but it seems to hit at sort of a really transitional period in a lot of different ways. It hit at the period, and I remember very distinctly because, you know, this was the time of my life where I was living in Alaska and just like trying to find ways to kill time. 2009 was sort of the period where streaming went from something that was sort of like a curio to like a mainstream way of consumption. 2009 is a bit removed from the peak of what we consider the torture porn cycle. So a film that was sort of operating still in that mode a little bit, though we'll talk about that, and I argue this is doing something different. You know, it would have felt a little out of date. It would have felt like, you know, a latecomer to that particular curve. And this also, I mean, let's be honest here. This was sort of the beginning of the end of Dennis Quaid's first phase of his career as a quintessential leading man. I mean, this movie came out the same year as Pandorum, which is another interesting departure for him in the type of roles that he normally does, but not a movie that I would think of as successful in any way, shape, or form. You know, I think that this was kind of like the wrong film at the wrong time, through the wrong distribution channels for a lot of different reasons. And I'm glad that Richard weighed in and kind of shared the perspective that he did have, because yeah, I can understand how something that was like, don't worry guys, we'll make our monies back on physical media in 2009 would have been just like a dagger in the back for this film, and which otherwise has a lot of things going for it. I want to talk about since we started with the notion of torture porn, and Ari, I'm going to kick this back to you. Would you describe this as torture porn? Do you think that this belongs in sort of the same breath as things like Hostel, you know, any of insert an Eli Roth movie here? Does it feel like that kind of a movie to you? Because it doesn't quite feel like that kind of a movie to me, although it certainly like at times moves a lot like one of those types of films. And I can understand why watching a trailer, you would feel like you're just about to get like Eli Roth retread here.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big fan of like the Saw franchise and the Hostel films actually. And this is, it's very different because I don't think that like in those movies, the gore and the violence and the torture aspect of it are meant to be the forefront of the story. I think that there's imagery that definitely calls back to some of the gruesomeness of those films. And, when you see things like someone putting a contraption on someone's face to keep their eyes open, that kind of elicits a certain memory of like, oh God, yeah, that's very Saw-like. And some of these, the layouts, even a little bit of because of course like the suspension device that the killers use to display victims and to torture them essentially, there it is a little Saw-like. It is very Trap-like. So in that sense, that's kind of where it gives that vibe. But again, it is kind of just a unique amalgamation of a lot of different influences, I feel like. And some of that imagery too is very like Seven. it's not as stylized, I'd argue, but it's there. And so yeah, I do feel like there's echoes of it, but yeah, I'd be more apt to agree with you in that it's not, I wouldn't categorize it as part of that whole torture porn or neo torture porn, post torture porn world. Yeah, there's some influences, but yeah, just here and there.
Yeah, again, the influences are graphic imagery of fetuses and graphic imagery of maybe like a flash to a death sequence very quickly. But, I'm thinking of one simple character death with a bone saw that we don't really see anything. It's not that it wants to show you the saw cutting into bone and, rib cages and stuff like that. It's more about the character who is forced to watch this and the character who is forced to live with the action that they have seen versus the audience reveling in the gratuity that is happening
Mm-hmm.
off camera. So I think the influences are absolutely there because it is still in grasp of the torture porn era. But I thought more of, to mention the Poughkeepsie tapes again. Like it's actually hilarious that you brought this to us, Ari, because I thought of that movie a ton, following our last conversation, and the way that this is very much looking at the footage, looking at things of that nature, talking to the criminals who are like mocking the detectives to their face and don't care
Mm-hmm.
about what they're doing. So that is the more, I think, the more prevalent theme. It is more of a detective played by Dennis Quaid, and how he might neglect his family and he works too much, and how that's going to take a toll on him and stuff like that. And also, it's like it's an internet thriller in a way. I know it's not really shown that
Mm.
much, but the four horsemen, let's say, and the people connected doing the killings, they're connected by chat rooms, and they're connected by dark web stuff, and they're connected by everything in the Den and Unfriended Dark Web and all that, all those other films that have since come out and tried to really capitalize on the evilness that can, well, number one, the evil that lurks on these chat rooms, and the evil that lurks in the nether regions of the web, and how that can influence others and drive them to do things. So, again, it's not a forefront theme where this is taking place online, and it's not a screen life movie. But in the background, when you realize like this is a commentary on internet culture as well, like that, it's these little things keep like bubbling up throughout the film, and they may not hit you in the face, but they're there, and you're like, okay, so you're like trying a few things here. It's not just a cut and dry serial killer case.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I think too, something, Donato, to your point, is the way, kind of what is the focus here? Like, what are where are the shocks coming from, or the twists coming from? And it's not necessarily always the violence and the gruesomeness. It is kind of this like twisty morality, around, look at what you've done. Now you're gonna pay, and you're gonna have to witness this being done. And when yeah, there's a few moments where it really revels in that. But it also, in a way, like, there's an era of film where topics like the death penalty, like Life of David Gale, and abortion, and these highly politicized um topics are kind of the crux of the film's themes and what it really is based around. And here I think it's interesting because that those kinds of movies, it feels like some of that influence is here, because it's like, it's touching on child sexual abuse, and homophobia and gay bashing, and suicide at a point, and or attempted suicide. So it's, it's all this stuff that's like, oh, that's in poor taste. Like, if you were to see a lot of these things used for shocks now, people would probably be more likely to say it's in poor taste. And I think in that time, that's why it kind of really captures this era of film and of genre film in general, where people didn't give a fuck. They were going to talk about what they were going to talk about and show what they were going to show.
Yeah, I love that we've each come up with kind of a different lens through which to view the way that the film does violence. Because for me, the thing that it made me think of is broken people and sadomasochism. Of course, it's Clive Barker all the time. Like, I got
Mm-hmm.
strong Clive Barker vibes, because the violence and the distortion and like the body mod stuff is also very bloodless. Like,
Yeah.
it's not bogged down in like the graphic nature of it. It's almost like elegant, in a way that shows me that, like, yeah, like this is there's a little bit of Barker love going on here. This is not an accident. Hooks in skin and not a lot of blood, and some like psychosexual cinematography. I'm like, that's good. I see what you're doing, Jonas Åkerlund, and I like it. But it is interesting to look back at this, and I'd like you to actually unpack that a little bit more, Ari, just because I know that this is your area of expertise in particular.
Hmm.
The notion of the way that this movie treats mental health is we have to play a little bit of a shell game as critics. And Donato and I probably, because a lot of our stuff is relatively recent, we probably don't get into the weeds as much with this as other podcasts do, with the notion of like relative morality or subjective morality when it comes to
Hmm.
viewing this. But I think this is an interesting example because it is approaching its subject matter with a tenderness that is like surprisingly a big step above and beyond what a lot of its contemporaries were doing, and
Hmm.
yet still feels incredibly retrograde when run through the gamut of today's horror films.
Hmm.
So maybe that's something I'd love to get your opinion on, is when you look at something like this. 2009 isn't that long ago. What is the mental juggling act, or what are the lens through which you're viewing something, and allowing it to be an artifact of its time a little bit?
Yeah, I think I the way that I approach art in general, and I'm not someone who would ever advocate for censoring art and telling someone they can't show something they want to show, no matter how upsetting it is. I do think that there are reactions, especially now, that people should prepare themselves for if they choose to show certain things. And that is just kind of how society is. But the idea of like, oh, we need to ban XYZ, like, I can never get behind that, because I do think art is, censoring art is just kind of it's a really, really slippery slope as far as free speech and expression. But I will say that, with my obvious interest in psychology, and which also has a very, very murky, shadowy history behind it. One thing, a couple concepts that I learned about a few years back that really helped me in the film world, especially with a lot of talks around um, appropriateness and morality, and keeping safe spaces, available for people who want to see films, and trigger warnings and things like that, is this idea of presentism versus historicism. And so in the realm of psychology, historicism is looking at things uh, from the perspective of the time in which they were developed or occurred. So when we're looking at certain practices in psychology and ways of approaching research or treatment, or kind of theories, it can be really easy to write everything off, full stop, as this was sexist, this was racist, this was homophobic. It was all of those things, and that is like undeniable. And also, there is some merit in understanding the context in which these things were allowed to happen, or why they happened, or why people were interested in them in this way. And it's always a lesson. So I think it's kind of that historicism versus presentism. Presentism would be taking your perspective of what is appropriate to put on film to a film that came out 30 years ago. Like, there is such a disconnect there that it's like it just doesn't make sense to do that. And it bothers me when people do that, because that's just not how the world works. That's not how art works, and also like not how time works. So let's kind of get our heads wrapped around the context of films. Like, I think it's important, like film literacy around knowing when a film came out, and who the director is, and who the writer was, and what they're kind of all about, and what they were about at the time, what was going on in society at the time. So things that maybe seem, I guess, like unsavory, or really tacky to show on screen in one point in time, kind of were just the norm in another. And it's not, I don't think it's necessarily a situation where you're condoning, anything being placed on screen, but it's like that's how I like to engage with art. I think it's a conversation, looking at it with curiosity. And so yeah, so things like that, I that's kind of how I try to do it. Like, let's take a historicist perspective. Let's think about the context and the time, and that makes it easier for me, I think, when I'm approaching movies that are a bit older, especially for when I haven't seen them before.
Yeah, I mean, for obviously there's a scene in the movie we're discussing that obviously, like, I will not repeat, but Eric Balfour is playing a character who is very disapproving of his gay brother, and
Hmm.
he says some choice words over and over again.
Hmm.
But the movie is not advocating for that, and Ari, that's what you're saying about like the historical
Yeah.
aspect of all that. Like, this is a 2009 movie, and when you watch it, it's not advocating for the usage of that word. It's not giving anyone a pass for it. It is actually just it's a time capsule. It's like maybe we were using this too much in dialogue in 2009, and it's
Mhm.
about looking back at it and why it was there and contextualizing that and seeing the growth since then versus the thinking that like no, this, let's scrub this completely from every movie in history. It's like, well, we actually have to learn from it. Like it actually brings up a better subject to say like, okay, we just heard a word in this movie that was released in the 2000s. Why is that bad? Do we realize why it is bad? And there's a reason why it's been changed.
Mhm.
It's a hard conversation to have because we also have this conversation all the time nowadays because everyone wants to write off a problematic protagonist or something of that nature because
Yeah.
no one wants to read into it. No one wants to, art is not endorsement. Art is just creating a character. Like there's nothing that says you have
Mhm.
to act like this character because this is what you see on screen. Like no, you're actually supposed to have a little bit of more reading comprehension and look into it and look into why this character is doing what they're doing and why the filmmaker might actually be making a point with them versus saying, no, I've created this character, therefore this is what I believe in and who I am.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that that's hearing. I'm not someone who hears the f bombs and gets very immediately jarred in film for that sake. Like if I were to hear someone tell me that in real life, which has happened in the recent years, still happens. But that's a different effect. So I think just kind of understanding what I'm going into. If I'm choosing to engage with art that is, rated R and has a lot of these themes and is, kind of has nasty characters who are going to say and do nasty things, the Eric Balfour character is not meant to be viewed as like some kind of great dude. And so, yeah, he would be talking to his brother like that. And that is a reality for a lot of people, especially in 2009. But even now, I mean, again, like Justin Long drops the F bomb in Barbarian, and people were really mad. And all I could think is like, well, he's supposed to be a piece of shit. And there you go. There's another piece of evidence that he is. So,
Yeah, there's a lot. The character in question. I don't think it's a spoiler to say Patrick Fuge's character is the character, and Eric Balfour's his brother. There's a
mhm,
lot of things that we would read now as be like, oh, like the self-loathing gay tropes and things of that nature. But
mhm.
I would be. I mean, if only we knew somebody whose husband ran a podcast that explicitly looked at queer representation in film through a queer analysis, I would be really interested to listen to Trace talk about this on Horror Queers. I think this would be an interesting example for them because I think that he could really dig into that a bit.
Yeah, I think that there would be, again, it's a mixed bag in the queer communities with certain language. Like sometimes people don't like they can't even be comfortable with the word queer because a lot of the connotations of it when they were growing up, and a lot of that is generational. I work with a lot of younger folks now, and that's very normal for them to refer to themselves in their communities as queer. So, there's a lot of consideration to be done. And I think you just have to be willing to do that and curious about it, as opposed to writ large just writing it off.
So I'm going to pivot like 180 degrees here, unless Donato, you have one more thing you want to throw in there at the end.
No, I was just gonna say, there are movies that are meant to tackle that kind of issue, and I don't think Horsemen is one of those.
That's a
No,
really good.
more so
That's a
just a
really good
product
coda.
of its time.
Yep.
Well, let me ask you a question, and I don't want to be mean. I'm not a mean film critic. Donato knows I'm not a mean film critic. Ari knows I'm not a mean film critic. I do not like to be mean, but I have to ask: does Dennis Quaid make this movie hard to watch? Like
He,
it is. I understand why they cast him, and I understand why he would take that role, but I feel like there's just such a misunderstanding of the type of movie that he's in terms of like the way to play that character, the sincerity, like the idea that you're, I don't know, the movie is what it isn't when everybody else in the cast and everything else about the film suggests they know exactly what type of movie they are. Is that a catastrophic error for this film? And I'm sorry, Dennis, if you're listening. I have a positive review of The Intruders, or the what is it, The Intruder, whatever the your one from a few years ago is. I have a positive review of that film on Rotten Tomatoes, so you cannot be mad at me.
we love you, Dennis. This movie in that way, he makes it camp. It is campy. His performance, it is like in the truest sense, like failed seriousness. Maybe I don't know what his what Jonas was telling him during filming, and maybe only him apparently, but he is kind of in a different movie, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to it, and a little bit into kind of what I was talking about. Like there's like a trash element in that, like there's a lot of really horrific things going on, and he's playing this character like really hamming it up, and in a way that's like atonal and just like doing its own thing. And there are a couple of other moments with some other of the villainous characters that come across that way too, but he really for the most part, I would say like it's probably worse the first couple acts. I think in the, the ending, I really actually do like it. I like his performance. I like how that all plays out, but you're not being mean at all. No, he was chewing up that whole set, and hopefully he had fun.
Well, and I also think it doesn't help that the film does feel underwritten as parts. The
Yeah.
entire relationship between Dennis Quaid and his two children, as he's the hard-working cop that works all the time, and he wants to go to hockey games with his kids, but he gets calls the minute they're leaving. These scenes are just so. I don't want to say comical, as in the what is happening is comical in the sense that a father is neglecting his children, but it is hilarious when he's about to go to the sporting event and be a good dad, and then his phone rings, and like, both kids just look at the phone and they just like hang their heads and they're like, oh man, and they just like taking their face paint off and stuff. So you just have these moments that aren't, I think the moment themselves just don't fit with the film that's trying to happen. But again, we are talking about a movie where Clifton Collins' character is just named Stingray. Like, he just gets called Stingray the whole movie. He's not a person. He is just a cardboard cutout of a like partner for Dennis Quaid.
Yeah, hearing Dennis Quaid yell Stingray the way that he does too, like that sent me when I watched it again. I was like, I do not remember that, and that is something I should remember from this movie forever.
Stingray!
It's definitely memorable. But yeah, Matt, I agree. Like that's kind of the sense I got too. Like those scenes that are meant to be played on like pulling at our heartstrings and really establishing this relationship. All I could think is like there's a version of this film where this man gets CPS called on him quickly and he doesn't get to solve any cases because he is neglecting these children, showing this kid, letting this kid look at crime scene photos, and it's just it doesn't work until it does for me. And it only works for me at the end because I remember this movie having, the kind of the whole twist of what happens, which I guess I don't know how much we want to be explicit about that, but
If
I
you're
mean,
this far in on like, if you've been listening for an hour to a podcast about Horsemen, this is what you came for.
So the fact that Lou Taylor Pucci, his son, ends up being one of the a part of this ring of killers, and he tries to kill himself using the machine and making Dennis Quaid watch it. And really, I remember the moment of watching Dennis Quaid go into the room and it's just like painted white, and it's just like all you had to do was go into his room. Like that conceit as like a twist works really well for me. The performances in advance of that, okay. Dennis, we love you again. Go read Matt's positive review of the Intruder or whatever. I never saw that, but yeah, if he's anything like in that, like he is in this, I'll happily watch that.
well, I want to pose a final question, or a closing question, how we want to do it before we get to the end of the podcast. But so that ending, we're on it. We're talking about it. It's Lou Taylor Pucci, the ignored son of Dennis Quaid, and this is my question to you guys. Like, do they make the right choice with who is this ringleader for this entire group? Because the other horsemen have like legitimate abuse cases and have been through horrific shit, and like they come to this group with a lot of trauma. And that is not to say Lieutenant Pucci's character didn't, has no trauma. That is not to say that, the death of his mother weighs heavy, and the neglect of his father has done something to him. But at the end of the day, like, it's just the whiny white guy who is kind of like the quote unquote villain of the end of the film, where is there more impact if it actually addresses that like the other characters here might have gone through more things and yet they're just not in the picture anymore and they don't get the finale moment?
Yeah, I think for me, so again, it's kind of like leaning into the camp of it too. Like as much as I do think like the emotional intention works for me more than it probably should here in that particular finale. I would say I could believe it now. I think at the time, when I watched this some years, I don't even know how long ago it was, maybe like a decade for the first time. I remember thinking like, That's what he's that role. That's interesting. The idea of like, did he kind of earn that role? I think no, again, this is just like bias as someone who works clinically with young people pretty often. Kids are kids' brains are just so mushy and not fully formed, and they're impulsive and they do really crazy shit. And so I could believe it getting to that point, especially these days with kind of how kids grow up with the internet and probably go down the darkest rabbit holes before they're even in school these days. So, yeah, I mean, I could see it. And also, just speaking from traumatic perspective, like you can't really, it's not really necessarily the nature of what happened. It's when it happened and how it impacted you. So, I mean, as far as that goes, did he earn his membership? Sure. Yeah, I think if that's how he felt, I guess, and that's how he reacted to his mom's loss and blaming his dad for it and the aftermath of their family basically just falling apart and being neglected. I could see that. It wasn't as outlandish for me. Um yeah, I don't know. It's I mean, again, there's just a big part of it that is about suspension of disbelief and leaning into the also the camp of it all.
Yeah, it is suspension of disbelief, absolutely, and certainly a little bit of subjective morality when it comes to how that ending plays out. But I
Mhm.
think, I have two types of films, which is inexplicable. I have like 3 hour long slow burn horror movies where nothing happens in the last 30 seconds, and then I have movies like this. Those are my two modes. Those are my two looks as a horror fan. And what I find myself is I grade movies like this on such a sliding scale. Like I'm so into like the pieces that work for me, and I pay so little attention to the stuff that doesn't. And one of the things that really works for me here is in an era where everything about the internet was a moral panic about like the corruption of youth. This film very explicitly points its fingers at the parents, like across the
Mhm.
board.
Mhm.
Yes, Zhang Ziyi's character is played as the Hannibal Lecter of this movie, absolutely, and that's great to see because she's wonderful.
Mhm.
But everything that happens to the characters that causes them to go this route is the failure of their support groups and the failure of their family. And the film doesn't try to present them within the bounds of 2009 cinema as abnormal or immoral or evil so much as in their own way victims. And I think that that's when you stack up all of the movies about the internet and how bad all horror films about the internet throughout the history, the number of movies that might position people that have gone evil or broken in some way because of the internet, but maintain a bit of grace for them, it's small. So this falls into the minority of films, I think, where they're like, yes, these are bad people, but nature versus nurture, right? Like it didn't
Mhm.
have to be this way. Most films just be like, yeah, bad from the beginning, broken from birth. Like they were always going to grow up to be a serial killer. This movie suggests that they had a little bit of help along their way, which I find kind of relieving.
Yeah, definitely. That's the nature versus nurture, I think, is a big part of resolving maybe some of that moral ambiguity in the film. And I mean, yeah, it's not, he's no, we need to talk about Kevin situation. So there's a lot of, arguments to be made for how we get impacted. And again, I know that people get very sensitive too about using mental health as and things like trauma as a catalyst for someone being dangerous. Oh gosh, that person is crazy, they're unhinged, they're going to become a serial killer. And that there are lots of films that handle that in a really cheap way. But I think when you can reasonably draw a thread between something really horrific that happened to someone and their horrific reaction to it, that makes sense more logically to me. And I can forgive some of that a little more. So yeah, I do think it's really interesting in that way too. That's a good read, Monocle.
And not even to say it doesn't work for me. It was just a question. I was curious to see how it plays for everyone, because I can see that ending now, and especially like you talking about being in the present and looking at things historically, I can see that playing a certain way and not hitting some people. But yeah, it was just it's just the way it turns out at the end. You're both shocked but not, because I hilariously was watching it with Amelia, and 5 minutes before that scene, I'm like, I bet it's the kid, right? Like the kid's behind this all. So like, I don't know if the horseman, sorry, not the horseman. I don't know if horseman pulls off its who done it as well, let's say, as some other films. But then again, it doesn't want to. Like it gives you half of the villains. Again, they're not villains, I shouldn't say that, but it gives you half of the horsemen pretty early on. I think it's having fun, and that campy element that you keep bringing up, Ari. I think that is the right mindset to have when you watch Horsemen. Don't take it as seriously as maybe it takes itself at times. And I think that's the path to glory here.
That's why I thought y'all would have fun with it. If you could approach it through that lens, why not? It's and again, with this cast, it's pretty stacked for the time, especially as far as genre, people we love in the genre. So yeah, I think that's how I choose to view it. And if I watch it again in the future, I will absolutely go in and describe it to the people I'm watching it with as, kind of like a product of its time, and also just like pure camp, kind of graphic at times, but just really, it's a mixed bag of different tricks, and camp is one of them. So yeah.
Well, since you're talking about having to pitch this film to people in the future, that brings us to the last question, the question we always end with, which is, this movie has been forgotten. Is there a place for this movie to find an audience in the future? And if so, how does it get there? And Ari, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Yeah, I think so. If for no other reason than, kind of like a time capsule look at that whole the dark side of the internet's influence on younger folks and on really vulnerable people, that is still super relevant. That I'm afraid it will just always be relevant. There are always going to be young people who are vulnerable. There are always going to be people who have gone through really terrible things that need community, and sometimes they fall into bad communities and bad circles of people, just to be seen and just to feel understood. So that's maybe giving this movie way more credit thematically than it really earns. But I will say, like, it could be kind of just a fascinating watch for some people who kind of want to jump back in time a little bit. And again, it's like this class of film that doesn't really get made in this way anymore. So I definitely think it could find its own little niche audience, and Twitter could be really helpful in that. If you threw that shit back on Netflix or something, people would probably eat it up at this point. People love true crime, people, for better or worse. People are really into things that are, looking at, let's uncover the killers and let's look at motives, and that kind of obsession having been exploding in recent years more and more in the mainstream. With that case, I feel like, yeah, there might be a place for it.
Donato, what you got?
I mean, can we just like comprehend the fact that the Snowman has 200 plus reviews on Rotten Tomatoes and Horseman doesn't? I mean, if we're talking about campy true crime that maybe understands itself but doesn't at the same time, it is baffling to me that Horseman was so pushed under the rug, while again movies like The Snowman, like, which came out, what was that, 2017, so years later and stuff like that, and you got Fassbender in the lead role. But I am still aghast that more people haven't, or I guess more people at the time didn't see Horsemen. So the only way we're going to get it back is again through streaming. You're not really going to be able to do a boutique release on something that is Lionsgate and Dennis Quaid and all these things. Like, it's out there, it's not really going to get a resurgence that way. You just need to pair it with the right true crime movies, and you just need to pair it with things. I would even bring it up in terms of like the Poughkeepsie tapes or films along that nature, where it is true crime but also very horror forward. Again, we can do a nice little triple feature. Excuse me, Rogers. We can do a nice little triple feature of certified forgotten titles between Crimson River, that we did with John Barkan, Poughkeepsie tapes, which we did with you, and now Horsemen, which we did with you. So someday when we get to program our certified forgotten film festival, that will be a night. It will just be like true crime horrors, and I think people will underestimate Horsemen, but at the same time, well, actually, I think they'd underestimate it in two ways. They would underestimate the horror elements, and then underestimate maybe the campy elements that we've brought up a few times now.
Yeah, there's a little bit of it that's just to jump back in there, that is reminiscent of like 8mm, like that type of vibe of a film where it's a little sleazy, it's a little like over the top. It's some of the imagery is meant to be very shocking, but it kind of it doesn't really come together the way it probably intended to. So I think even like with pairing of something, a Nick Cage doing that kind of stuff, that could probably work too.
it's just lacking that little bit of really brutal in your faceness that, let's say, Lords of Chaos, Mr. Åkerlund's
There it is.
masterpiece. I waited until the end. I got out of the
Oh.
conversation about Horsemen, but I adore Lords of Chaos, and I think
Fantastic.
Horsemen, exactly. I think Horsemen's missing a little bit of that intensity, but then again, Lionsgate maybe would not have been okay with that. So you're talking about a studio versus how Lords of Chaos came to be. So it's missing that little spark of just really, really gut punch, disgusting, just repulsiveness. And I think that would actually make it more accessible to horror fans who might be talking about it a little more.
I'll only add that, and maybe this is just me. It might just be me. And if you're listening to this and if this sounds kind of wild to you, then I apologize. I am more likely to rewatch Pandorum than I am to rewatch Alien. And the reason for that is because I know that Alien is brilliant. And I know that every time that I watch Alien, it will feel brilliant. But I never remember how I feel about a movie like Pandorum. And there's an element of excitement in rewatching something that you felt one way about, and maybe you feel differently about it in the future. And so, to all of the points that you've made, Donato, and Ari, about where this sits in sort of the lexicon of true crime films, I am much more likely to watch Horsemen than Seven going forward, because I know Seven's really good, and I know when I watch Seven, I'll be like, Seven's really good. But I'm going to be curious that there is more opportunity, I think, for me to feel like I'm learning something about myself or learning something about how I watch movies from Horsemen. And that's kind of true across the board for all of like these B kind of movies. I'll always watch a B movie before I watch an A movie. It's not the fact that like those movies aren't good. It's just my opinion is less set in stone, and it's more fun to see if it shifts around a little bit. It's more fun to kind of revisit that and see if you feel differently about it. So I think that's maybe where Horseman sits, is the notion that like it's not an established classic. And so yes, people won't revisit it regularly for that reason, but there might be people to go back to it because they saw it on the shelf at Blockbuster in 2009, or they remember watching it in the theater but remember nothing else. I didn't mention this before. I truly don't know if I've seen this movie. I cannot remember for the life of me if I watched this movie or not. I was trying to figure it out the entire goddamn time. I think maybe I have, but I can't say with any degree of certainty. And I think that's the target audience for this in the future.
And I think that leads to actually like way more fun group watches too. Like if that's the vibe of the night, I agree with what you're saying. I would rather show some people Horsemen to be like, what the fuck do you think about this, versus Seven that's like, no, you're all gonna like this. Like we all like Seven, we all agree that it is a fantastic movie. I want to see that communal reaction and the conversation that happens when you watch Horsemen versus the certified classic, let's say.
Yeah, no, agreed. Yeah, and I think too there's that something just kind of fascinating about rewatching a film that throws so much at you from so many different sources, because it's like a different watch every time. Like you can watch it while drunk, you can watch it after smoking a little bit, you can watch it late at night. It's just kind of like going to elicit a different reaction because there's so much there, and it doesn't always work in the same watch. So I think this watch is way different for me than the first time I watched it. None of the camp stuff played for me. I took everything very seriously the first time, and I thought it was solid, but this was just a very different experience. So yeah, I think if you're willing to be a little adventurous and go into it looking for a different experience every time, this is definitely a movie that would probably do that for you.
All right. There is the final word on 2009's Horsemen. I would recommend, it is streaming on HBO Max. So if you are looking for a movie to watch and you want to watch something that is not necessarily good, but also kind of good at the same time, that's the vibe we're putting down. I think you'll enjoy it. Check it out on HBO Max. Ari, it's been great to have you as a guest. I know you've been writing up a storm recently. So where do folks go on social media to follow you and make sure they don't miss your next liminal horror piece?
Yeah, so you can reach me on Twitter, Instagram. I have a Facebook that kind of exists there sometimes, at the Ari Drew, TheAridrew, and you can find anything I write. I don't write a ton, but when I do write, I usually write about things that really spark a fire in me and things that I'm really passionate about, and a lot of it are filmmakers that are releasing cool shit. So yeah, you can find me on Bloody Disgusting if you'd like to read any of that.
Donato, my friend, you've got a lot coming up. Where do people go to find you?
As always, you can find me at Donatobomb, DonatoBomb, on Letterboxd, Instagram, Twitter, and Hive. I don't really do as much on Hive right now, but like, it's still there. We should all go there someday and hang out. Things on the horizon, it's just more of the same. We're gonna write some horror features. We're gonna write some horror reviews. We're gonna do some other regular reviews. I just like to keep myself busy, as y'all know. So just follow along and maybe hit that Authory too. Authory is a great thing, and they just put my interview up again, so I got to bump them again.
As for me, you can follow me at Matt Monagle on Twitter. I have an Authory. It's like Matt Monagle or Matthew Monagle. I never remember how I call myself. But I will use my plug time to remind you to go visit www.certifiedforgotten.com. And yeah, if you like what you see and you want to support us financially, you can support us on Patreon by becoming a patron. And anything from $1, $3, $5 will go a great deal towards helping us add more writers and more articles each month. And if you don't have money to spare, that's okay too. You know what? We barter in reviews, Spotify and iTunes reviews. We love them. We'll take them. Tell everybody how you were inspired to go rewatch Horsemen by listening to this episode. I promise you, it'll make a difference in somebody else's mind, I guess. Ari, it has been great to have you back on the show. You are in that 2-timer club, which we absolutely fucking love. And this is not the last time you'll appear on the podcast as well. So we hope to talk to you again soon.
Yes, thank you both so much, and it was a blast. Hope to see you all again in the future.
Donato.
Stay red.